As someone who spent years compiling and sharing my opinions on media, including criticisms with how certain stories were handled, I recognize the innate flaw that comes from overvaluing first impressions and personal preferences, which is a lack of incentive to recognize the intent and purpose behind narrative decisions that caused me to have a negative reaction in the first place. Which is why I've recently taken a bigger interest in explaining things rather than criticize. People will often say that the real fans are the ones that love the series while still acknowledging its flaws. I, on the other hand, take the stance that real fans are the ones that love the series and better understand the flaws than the average person. Which is why I'm making this video, because Kaguya Otsutsuki is among the most disliked villains in the entirety of the series. More people know about why she's poorly written than who she even is in the first place. So because of that, I decided to take further steps into analyzing this character beyond the superficial structure of the story, and to do that I even decided to do a bit of research into Asian mythology, because it does actually offer some context into what she's based on. Plus, a large majority of the Western Naruto fanbase, due to cultural barriers, don't have as much knowledge on Asian mythology, which is not necessarily a big deal. I don't know anything about Asia either, but since Naruto is inspired by Japanese, Chinese, Indian, and other cultures from Asia, I felt like it would be important to offer a bit of information on Asian mythology, especially if we're going to analyze the series. Now, Kaguya seems to be, at least in part, inspired by a Japanese folklore called The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. In it, there's a character that would eventually be named Kaguya, who was found somewhere in the bamboo forest as a tiny infant, who would eventually be raised by an elderly couple. I won't go too in depth with this story because from what I've read, it doesn't seem to be too relevant to the characterization of Kaguya from Naruto. A few things to note is that in the anime's adaptation of Kaguya's backstory, she's also found in the middle of a bamboo forest and was shining bright, much like in the folklore. Another noteworthy thing is that in the classic story, she's originally from the moon, and at one point she was inevitably visited by her own people in order to retrieve her. This group of people certainly draws some parallels with the Otsutsuki clan, minus the lunar origins, especially because at one point they gave her an elixir of life which resembles a divine fruit. Where she differs from the original story is that in Naruto, she takes on independent action by defying the orders of her clan, while in the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, Kaguya takes on a more fatalist approach and accepts her fate of return to the moon, despite her not wanting to leave due to her growing attached to the people on Earth. However, where I believe the character was the most inspired by was the legend of Chang'e. In Chinese mythology, there exists the goddess of the moon called Chang'e. Now, there are two different versions of the tale that is pointed as the origin of this goddess. Both of them started off the same way, with the existence of 10 sons that were threatening to eliminate the world. But then Hohi, who was the husband of Chang'e, took out 9 of the 10 sons and afterwards was rewarded with an elixir of immortality, but in the end he never actually consumed it. Instead, he gave it to his wife, and neither of them decided to take it since they didn't want to abandon each other. However, in an unfortunate turn of events, one of Hohi's apprentices tried to take the elixir from Chang'e, but she resisted and opted to consume it, leading her to fly to the moon and inhabiting there for eternity, becoming the goddess of the moon. The second version of this tale likely played a bigger role in inspiring the character because in this version, Hohi, after defeating the 9 sons, became a tyrant, and because Chang'e didn't want his wicked ruling to continue on forever, if he were to ever eat the elixir of immortality, she decided to eat it herself and became one with the moon. Now, you can view this in two ways. Either Kaguya represents Chang'e, with the Otsutsuki clan embodying Hohi's tyranny, or you can view Kaguya as taking the role of Hohi, someone who was at one point aiming for peace on Earth, only to then devolve into tyrannical leader. Kaguya was someone who was sent by her clan to harvest the divine tree, which brings light to fruits that once eaten grants the consumer what they describe as godhood, similarly to how elixirs of immortality seem to offer divine power to the consumer. Kaguya was assigned to monitor the god tree on Earth, but due to her growing attached to human society, she consumed the divine fruit, which led to the activation of the first ever infinite Tsukiyomi in the hopes of setting up an army of Zetsus that can be used to combat the invasion of the Otsutsuki clan, which came at the cost of sacrificing people's freedom. So in a way, she embodies the humanitarian altruism of one while embodying the tyrannical nature of the other. Kaguya, being a ruthless leader, comes as a result of the environment she surrounded herself with. She's an Otsutsuki who's been assigned to carry out operations that take away the life essence of planets in order to give rise to divine trees. She was even tasked to sacrifice herself for the continuation of the development of the chakra fruit. She was influenced by an environment that didn't nurture compassion and freedom, and as a result, when she came to value human life, her way of protecting it was through adopting forms of tyranny that resembled the clan she was now fighting against: power hunger, sacrifices, and lack of compassion. It's a movement born out of the distrust for human society in letting them fight for themselves. Kaguya came to the planet at around the time there were wars going on between civilizations. She sees herself as above them not just in power but in the ability to regulate themselves. It's how she came to be seen as a goddess by the population. Much like many gods, she's both worshipped and feared. She brought peace, but at the cost of unquestioned obedience and sacrificial offerings for their own sake. Now, one thing I find to be particularly interesting about the legend of Changi is that there's this tradition in Asian culture called the Mid-Autumn Festival, in which a common practice made there is giving offerings to the goddess of the moon. Now, this event is said to take place in the 15th day of the 8th month of the Chinese lunisolar calendar. The dates range depending on the year, but it's estimated to take place sometime between mid-September to early October. Now, the events of the war take place sometime around Naruto's birthday, meaning that Kaguya manifests in either the 9th or 10th of October. Now, these dates do seem a bit ahead of the estimated period of the 15th day of the 8th lunar month. I've looked into past dates and the most I've seen was 6th of October, but it's still pretty close, and given the small geological differences that might exist between our real-life planet and Naruto's version of Earth and other cosmologies, it's entirely possible that Kaguya rose at exactly the date when the Mid-Autumn Festival would occur. In fact, given this event exists largely because it's believed to be the day when the moon shines the brightest, it draws a lot of parallels with Kaguya's mythology, and even on some level the events of the series, since the moon's light was needed for the infinite Tsukuyomi to pass on to the entire human population, and what period would be more appropriate than when the moon's light shines the brightest. On the topic of the infinite Tsukuyomi, let's talk about Madara Uchiha. One of the biggest criticisms thrown at Kaguya has to do with the fact that she came at the expense of Madara being the final villain, and his resolution ultimately feeling unsatisfactory. I have a point of view to offer in regards to his death, but firstly, I'd like to briefly talk about yin and yang. Now, I won't go too deep about yin and yang because I actually plan to talk about this thing in a potential video I might make in the future, but this is important to explain a little aspect about Black Zetsu. You see, the concept of yin and yang can have multiple meanings, and alternatively, yin can represent the moon while yang represents the sun. So for Black Zetsu to be one to betray Madara in favor of Kaguya is actually appropriate, since yin, aside from representing the moon, to whom he works for the goddess of, it also represents darkness, much like his appearance, in contrast to White Zetsu. There are other ways yin and yang has been expressed, like how Hamura had the yin mark on his hand, and out of the two brothers, he was the one that was tasked to watch over Kaguya in the moon. Another form of subtle foreshadowing is via the Rinne Sharingan. What's also referred to as the Eye of the Moon seems to be a reference to the third eye, more specifically the sixth chakra Ajna, which in Buddhism and Hinduism is associated with your awareness and perception. It also tends to be described as the commanding center, and in the context of Naruto, this can have a deeper meaning. The infinite Tsukuyomi is achieved through awakening the third eye and flashing the effects of the Genjutsu through the light of the moon, very appropriate due to how Ajna tends to be correlated with light. Madara gained the ability to put everyone under an eternal state of illusion by manipulating their perception to the powers of the third eye. He believed that true peace was unachievable, and as a result, the only solution to truly bring peace into everyone is by manipulating their senses into living a fake peaceful world. In a way, he was instilling the opposite effect of awakening Ajna into other people. But what Madara didn't predict is that under the reality he was living and trying to enforce illusions into other people, he was living under an illusion all along. A side effect of awakening the third eye is that you become enlightened and transcendent into a higher form of consciousness, that to which exposes the truer nature of reality, similarly to opening yourself into a world beyond the matrix, and that reality that Madara was now exposed to was that of Kaguya. This is what some would consider a hot take, but I actually believe that Madara getting stabbed by Black Zetsu is one of the more appropriate endings to his arc that he could have received. Because while yes, I suppose the series could have ended in the traditional heroes beat bad guy and maybe Naruto talks no jutsu him, but with someone like Madara, I have my reasons for why I don't believe this would be as effective. Battles in Naruto are not just exchanges of fists, there are also ideological clashes between the fighters. Madara isn't a character that can have a progressive communication with anyone, including Naruto, because unlike the likes of Obito, Pain, and other villains, Madara is someone that has long rejected his own humanity. Unlike Obito, who takes on a more nihilistic approach by denying reality and his own individuality and invite the world of illusion, Madara chooses to abandon his entire humanity, not by blinding himself with a reality that justifies and compensates his despair while suppressing his feelings of doubt and past ambitions, but instead through taking upon himself to reach a higher form of humanity, that of a god. While Obito no longer saw himself as someone titled with a name that gave him an identity on Earth, Madara saw his own name as a symbol of a divine pursuit for the Mugen Tsukuyomi that will bring upon happiness into the world. A person like this cannot be opened up by other people who are still grounded in humanity, so for Naruto to defeat him and convince him of his ideals just doesn't seem like a feasible way to conclude his character arc. But of course, I don't think that it should just end with him getting defeated and not having a moment of ideological closure. The last conversation he has with Hashirama is an extremely important one for his character. It's a moment where he finally became humble and died alongside his longtime friend, reassured that perhaps the spread of the Will of Fire would one day lead to true world peace. But for this to happen, he needed to experience ego death, have his entire idea of the world completely shattered in order for him to revert to a humble state, and him getting stabbed by Black Zetsu was a perfect way of doing that. I explained this in my video talking about Madara's ideological downfall. He is a person that refused to have people behind his back. Hashirama abandoned his ties with Madara by literally stabbing him in the back in order to protect the village, which made Madara further reaffirm his belief that true understanding between people was impossible, causing him to never open himself up to anyone ever again. Madara no longer had partners. Obito was not a partner to him, he was a pawn. So was White Zetsu, the 9 Bijuu, and every person he used for his gain. The only individual he trusted was himself. Black Zetsu being the one stabbing him in the back was appropriate because Madara believed it to be the manifestation of his own will. In the end, almost feeling like being betrayed by his own will for simply following it. So in a way, despite him believing that solely trusting himself would protect him from being stabbed in the back, it was exactly this very thing that led him to getting stabbed at the end of the day, revealing him that the reality he had convinced himself, that of him being the savior based on old stones that he had read, was all an illusion. By awakening the third eye, he was now exposed to the undeniable truth that the path he took of self-grandeur was false, and it's through this moment of failure that he could now look outside of the box of his own defined pursuit and would bring light to something otherworldly, which represented true divine power. If the chakra fruit is a metaphor for the forbidden fruit, then Kaguya represents the original sin. It's through her eating the fruit that she gave birth to chakra on Earth, which over the years became inherited by the population and contributed to more wars and devastating deaths. The infinite Tsukuyomi involved the absorption of all chakra from humanity and even from the tailed beast through Madara's body, and by doing this, Madara unintentionally revived the mother of all chakra by concentrating it into one source, himself. Madara wanted to be above the ugliness of humanity by transcending it into something higher, but in doing so, he brought to life something inhumane that ultimately was the root of the ugly war cycles that humanity was destined to propagate, which is why it's important for Naruto and Sasuke to defeat her, because despite having different ideals, they still want to solve humanity's problems, not by transcending it or creating a new reality, but by directly confronting it. Kaguya is often referred by the fan base as the final antagonist, which is technically inaccurate because Sasuke was the true final antagonist of the series. Kaguya was more so the predecessor of the final battle between two fated ninjas that had the power to shift the tides of the world, but with conflicting ideologies. However, they were first tasked to confront the being to whom they originally inherited the power from, the mother of all chakra. Before they could change the world, they had to confront the original sin, and it's through them facing the source of all conflicts that disseminated in the shinobi history that they can now start a revolution, open a new path for humanity. The irony in all of this is that at their core, they're fighting against the same enemy. This sort of ties in with the theme of passing the torch. Madara was described by Hagoromo as further resembling Kaguya as he continued his quest, and if there's one thing both of them had in common is the unwillingness to pass the torch to the next generation. Kaguya isolated both her children and refused to listen and involve them in her management of their territory. Even after thousands of years, she still fights to stay alive and carry her will, gets frustrated by the idea of her predecessors carrying her chakra. Much like with Madara, her refusal to entrust anyone is ultimately what leads her to become an enemy of the same people she's fighting for. Madara once started off as a reincarnation of Indra, but in his attempt to gain the power of the six paths, he merged himself with Ashura's DNA, therefore allowing him to evolve into a deeper path far beyond what even the father of Indra and Ashura can endure. In truth, Hagoromo always showed a preference for Ashura, and this was because he obtained power through cooperation with other people, while Indra, being someone who inherited most of his father's powers, obtained power by himself alone due to how gifted he was, and Hagoromo believed that it was the individual path and power that led Kaguya to become the feared and heartless rabbit goddess that she was. It's also why Hagoromo decided to split the Ten Tails into 9 different beings, believing that cooperation would lead to a more peaceful future. It's what differentiates Madara from Naruto. They both became Jinchuriki and obtained the power of the 6 paths. Madara had 6 paths through merging the tail beast into one and becoming the 10 tails Jinchuriki. Meanwhile, Naruto possesses the powers of all of the 9 tail beasts individually united as a group. And while Naruto following the Will of Fire eventually led to one of the original propagators of this dogma reviving himself and continuing to entrust his power and will into the next generation, Madara's path to self-grandeur only led to the original propagator of his will coming back, but much in the same way that Madara manipulated and used people as pawns, the same was done to him in the end. And while she was striving to have all the chakra on Earth to herself, much like Madara, further illustrating to him the wrongful path that he was taking. I don't consider her a bad villain. In fact, looking at it critically, she's actually more fleshed out than a lot of characters in the series. And this is me strictly only talking about Shippuden. I haven't even touched on the Boruto material that might even contain more information about her. She is, however, confusing, not necessarily because it's hard to understand her personality and motivation, but more so because of her role in the story, despite playing a large position in the lore of the series. It's why it's easy for people to brush her off as someone shoehorned in to set up the Otsutsuki clan in Boruto. And frankly speaking, I'm not in the position to tell you exactly the intent behind her integration to the story. The only thing I can do is provide to you the context behind her character as much as I can gather. I actually have a different opinion on Kaguya from the one I had when I first read the series, because I feel like unlike before, I actually understand her, and I encourage people to do the same. At the end of the day, you still have the choice to hold on to the same cliche Kaguya sucks opinion, but if you watch through this video, I encourage you to look at Kaguya from a different perspective now.